Welcome, everybody, to the R&R Catcast, a fan-based podcast focusing on Montana State athletics. We're two dudes named Ryan from the state of Washington talking about our dear Montana State. We hope you enjoy. Welcome back, Bobcat fans. On behalf of Ryan and I, we hope in this unique time you have health, comfort, and purpose. One of the goals of the R&R is to continue to provide you with content. And I know for us, this podcast is one of our favorite ways we engage with our Bobcat community. We're currently focusing on reaching out to former players, media members, coaches, and others connected to Montana State. Well, Thorny is taking tonight off. It's his birthday, so I'm picking up some duties to introduce Paul Schwedelson of the Bozeman Daily Chronicle. Paul sat down with us recently. We talked about the turnover in Bobcat basketball, the absence of spring football, and some news on facilities. We already have a couple more interviews lined up, so look for those. Don't hesitate to send us a message on the Twitter machine, or you can talk to us through Bobcat Nation. We have a recurring thread over there. And as always, guys, send in those Golden Koozie questions. So without further ado, here's Paul. Welcome back, Bobcat fans. We're fortunate enough to have Paul Schwedelson of the Bozeman Daily Chronicle on with us tonight. Paul, how are you doing?
Great. I'm excited to be on for the first time.
Yeah, excited to have you on, especially for the first time coming on our show. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on.
It's been something I've looked forward to since you guys asked me, and obviously it'll be fun to talk about sports a little bit.
Oh man, we need some sport talk right now.
Yeah.
I heard that Chicago Bulls documentary had like 11 million viewers or something, which tells you just how much people want sports right now.
Yeah. Well, I was talking with some of my friends. I had like one of those scheduled Zoom calls, and I was like, guys, I gotta go at 7:00 because I gotta watch this live. And they were like, can't you just record it? And I was like, well, this will be like the closest thing I'll get to watching a sporting event with Twitter as a second screen.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I tuned in as well. It was awesome. And I watched the second one too. So ESPN ran it back hour later. It was just as good. It was awesome.
Yeah.
Well, for those who don't know, Paul Schwedelson is the reporter for the Bozeman Daily Chronicle who covers the men's basketball and the football teams, but at the moment, probably not as busy as he would like to be due to the virus that's going around. But what do you think, Ryan? Should we start off with basketball, or is there any other questions that you had? I know you had a couple questions you wanted to ask Paul first, maybe.
Yeah, I want to know. Well, I'm just looking at Paul's Twitter page right now, and a couple things that come. I see a running picture. Paul, are you a runner?
I would consider myself not a runner traditionally, because I guess I never really got into running seriously. I guess I would consider myself an amateur runner, but the profile picture on Twitter is from when I ran in the Bozeman Marathon. And I guess the photo is from when I was finishing and crossing the finish line at the Bozeman Marathon. So that was in September of 2019. Definitely a really, really cool moment.
Yeah, and that's so an impressive feat.
Yeah. So thank you. I appreciate that. And obviously, I guess you could say anyone who runs a marathon is a runner, but I personally wouldn't really consider myself that. Just kind of something I picked up, and kind of have started to do a little bit more and more.
Nice, man. Myself, I'm a runner. I would consider myself a runner. So I like the picture a lot, dude. That's pretty cool.
Oh, thank you.
I guess the other question is the question we have for all of our guests. How did you end up in Bozeman?
Well, good question. I grew up outside of New York City in Westchester County, then went to Syracuse University for college, and then graduated college in the spring of 2017. And then was just kind of applying for some different jobs, and then landed in Bozeman. And I've really enjoyed it so far, and I think it's a really cool place to live. Obviously, I think hopefully everyone listening to this podcast knows that, but we won't tell everyone else. Everyone wants to always be the last person to move here. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, you move there, and then it's all of a sudden it's your secret. No one else gets to move here.
Yeah, exactly. But I guess it was, pretty simple in terms of just kind of applying to jobs and ending up here.
Didn't know anyone out here or anything, just like Bozeman.
No,
sure.
that's pretty much a good way to describe it. Didn't really know anyone here. There were a couple people who, like a mutual friend on Facebook or a long lost friend from elementary school, or, had some kind of connection here or there. But for the most part, pretty much no one that I'm really close with or, still really like consistently in touch with. So pretty much moved here without ever seeing anywhere, being here or visiting, or just kind of moved out somewhat on a whim and just kind of hoped that it would work out. And I guess it has. So that's been good.
Well, we're glad that you did, because I think you do a great job for the Chronicle, and I enjoy reading your content.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, before we get into the interview, we'll just kind of give a rundown of what we're going to do tonight. So we're going to talk with Paul a little bit about the men's basketball. We had some movement within the program, and then we're going to talk some football, kind of like what is the impact of not having spring football mainly. And we'll finish up with just a little bit of maybe a small question on facilities and fundraising. But Thorny, what do you think? We should start with some basketball here?
I think so. I think that's probably the most newsworthy thing to be happening this week. Football, not a lot of action right now, but we had, 5 players left the team so far this offseason, and we've signed six players in the same time span. So it's a good kind of starting spot, I think, to talk.
I guess just to clarify a little bit, it's worth pointing out the 5 players who entered the transfer portal, 4 of them were on scholarship. So in terms of scholarship spots, talking about 4 players leaving, and then they signed 4 players in this signing period to go along with 2 players they signed in the November signing period.
Mm-hmm.
And initially, the 2 players signed in November, if you think about it in terms of replacing the graduating seniors, Harold Frey and Layden Ricketts. And then the 4 players signed this past week in the spring signing period are replacing the 4 scholarship players who entered the transfer portal after the season.
So the person who was not on scholarship, would that be Brent Finn?
Yes, that is correct. Good trivia question.
Well, Ryan was nice enough to do the research on, make sure we knew the 5. I was like, I know it's Paulo, Quinlan, Guilford. I couldn't remember Zach Hobbs. I couldn't remember the other guy. But so we'll just recap it for those listening who may not know. It's Michael Paulo, Zeke Quinlan, Quentin Guilford, or is it Gulliford? I'm sorry. How do you pronounce it?
Gulliford.
Okay. And then Zach Hobbs and Brent Finn have all entered the transfer portal for this year. The most surprising to me would be Michael Paulo, because he was a sprinkle recruit and played a decent amount of minutes last year, but he is in the portal as well. Now, Paul, would you say what's the kind of the timeline here? Did they transfer and then their guys were kind of recruited, or did the recruits kind of sign, which kind of maybe forced some of the transfers?
I guess that's a good question. I guess it was kind of simultaneous in the sense of coaches pretty commonly will recruit players somewhat anticipating the potential of transfers. Just because, right now I think there's over 700 players in the transfer portal for Division I teams. That's an average of about 2 players per team. So that's an average across the entire country, all 350 teams. So,
well, the Bobcats are bringing the average up right now.
So I think that, the coaches are cognizant of that, those trends. And so they recognize that there's the potential for transfers. And so they're kind of keeping an eye on who they're bringing in. And then also, I think there's also, if you look at it, with in terms of just like the playing time breakdown and Specifically Zeke Quinlan, Quentin Gulliford, and Michael Paulo were all originally recruited and signed when Brian Fish was the head coach. So there's some of that too involved in terms of like, different coach that then who recruited them. And so I guess it's kind of simultaneous. It's kind of hard to say, but you look at the playing time breakdown. I don't know how much any of them were going to play this upcoming year. There was a chance that, they'd be closer to the end of the bench than the front of it, let's say. And so, obviously players want to play, and maybe they recognize the other recruits that are coming in, and kind of shakes out like that. So probably I guess to answer your question, probably a combination of some kind of simultaneous occurrence.
Well, I misspoke earlier. I thought Paulo was a Sprinkle junior college transfer. That's kind of how I had remembered it.
Yeah, so he originally signed when Brian Fish was the head coach, and then this past season was his first season at Montana State. So obviously he had never played for Brian Fish, but he was recruited by Brian Fish.
Okay.
Or sorry, he only played at Montana State under Danny Sprinkle, but he was recruited by Brian Fish. So there was somewhat of a disconnect there, if that kind of makes sense.
No, it makes sense. So Sprinkle just like honored the commitment or kept the commitment.
Right. I believe he was already signed at that point. So he was essentially already on the team. Yeah. And if you think about the timing, Jabril Bello, Michael Paulo, and Caleb Bellich were the three players who never played for Brian Fish, but they were signed when he was the head coach. And so, but then it's kind of weird because those three players were all in their first season at MSU this past season, but so was someone like Amin Adamu, who Sprinkle signed. Although he was also being recruited by Fish simultaneously previously. So there's like a lot of like weird, it's like very difficult to like parse out some of that stuff. But Michael Paulo was signed when Brian Fish was the head coach.
Well, we can certainly say it wasn't a roster full of Sprinkle players.
This past season especially, yeah, for sure.
Now, I wonder if that's why we are seeing so much turnover right now, or if this will be the norm going forward.
I think there's probably a combination of both. One being that, maybe some of these players, specifically Quentin Gulliford and Zeke Quinlan, who maybe stayed on the team, hoping that they could kind of make their mark and have a chance to play. But then after this past season, knowing that, they didn't really get the playing time maybe that they desired at that point, it's like they gave a new coach a chance. They gave it a chance, a year, to see if it could work. And then it didn't. And then at the same time, so that I think is part of it, because, there's still some of that fallout from a coaching transition.
Sure.
But at the same time, there's also so many transfers in Division I men's college basketball. It's become so popular to do that it could become the norm, especially when you consider the upcoming legislation that could be passed allowing players to transfer from a Division I 4-year program to another Division I 4-year program and not have to sit out. And the fact that if there's immediate eligibility, there's a lot of people who think that could even further increase the number of transfers beyond 2 per team each year. So because, there'd be immediate eligibility. So you wouldn't have the rule that you have to sit out. So that could also be a factor. So in terms of what is the norm going forward, I think, that's a possibility that is probably going to continue, especially being that, that legislation is likely to pass according to a lot of different reports. So you factor that in. Going forward, it could continue to be the norm. And also in this year specifically, the fallout could continue from the coaching change.
Yeah. That legislation, I could see somebody like Tyler Hall, who ends up as a junior, kind of some recognition. He's going to get poached for a senior season. Kind of like, all right, you did all the development. We'll take him for his senior year. Thanks, Montana State.
Yeah.
Happening.
Yeah. And I know there's a lot of coaches around the country who, especially at the mid and low major level, that are kind of concerned about that. But it's an interesting situation because obviously the coaches might be concerned about it because, like you said, of that scenario you just laid out. But at the same time, I think there are only 5 sports that have this rule that make you have to sit out. And so, the other argument would be, any student at any university can transfer. And it's not like an engineering student has to sit out a year, when they transfer into a new engineering program at a different school.
Sure.
Those are obviously two arguments, you could go back and forth with. But there are a lot of coaches that are concerned about it.
Yeah, we don't need to go too much into the argument. I've thought a lot about it myself. I lean towards more of the player side. Like you said, why can't anybody transfer anywhere you want? There shouldn't be a coaching staff, a commitment to play sports at a university should keep you from going to another university to play sports. It's just kind of a weird thing if you really think about it. I think it's more the job of the coaching staff and the university to make a player want to stay. It should be giving them reasons not to leave.
Right. I guess I won't give my opinion on it just because as a reporter, that's not my place. But I'll leave the opinions up to you guys.
Well, we're not real hot takers here, that's for sure. Coldest takes in town.
So, Paul, I did have a question for you. As we're sitting here talking about basketball, and I'm thinking about this year under Danny Sprinkle. How was it being around the program with Sprinkle being the head coach? And maybe kind of juxtapose that with the time with Fish.
Well, I guess the biggest thing, and you pretty much can notice this right away from their practices specifically, is the coaching style. And I think a lot of fans noticed it at games too, in terms of the way they would handle themselves on the sidelines. And I don't think there's a right or wrong way, to have a coaching style. Mm-hmm. If you can find a way to be successful one way and that works, then that's great. And so you could be like Brian Fish and be yelling at players pretty much from the moment that the ball tips, and yelling at players the whole 40 minutes. Or you could be like Danny Sprinkle, who is much more mild-mannered on the sidelines and in practice as well. And most of the times when he would be yelling during games would be directed at the refs, whereas Brian Fish would just be kind of yelling all the time, constantly. And every coach has a different coaching style. There's no right or wrong way, but they are very different in that aspect. And I think anyone who went to any games and saw the two coaches coach, that was a pretty stark difference just in terms of those interactions with the players on the team. And so that's, to me, I would say what stood out the most in terms of what it was like being around the team. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would add is that Danny Sprinkle put a really high emphasis on embracing the community and embracing the Bozeman, Montana State University experience. And they would really encourage their players to attend volleyball matches or go to football games or, do different things. And that was another thing. And Danny Sprinkle really put a big emphasis on trying to improve attendance and embrace the fan base and drum up support. And so that was another thing that stood out to me, because so often we think of success in college athletics programs in terms of wins and losses. Whether this is right or wrong, that's a conversation for another time. But we so often think of success in college athletics in terms of wins and losses. And when I interviewed Danny Sprinkle after the season ended, he said he considered it a successful season. And I asked him, what factors made it successful in your mind? And he said finishing above 500 as one reason, but he also pointed to the increase in attendance. And whether that's right or wrong, or how important that is to you as a fan, like you can, everyone can have a different opinion on that. But I thought it was interesting that he highlighted that as a big focus for him and then executed on it. And so that also stood out to me.
Man, I would love to sit down with Harold Frey and pick his brain on that topic as well. I would be interested to see what he had to say.
I think Harold Frey is one of the most fascinating athletes I've covered, especially because of his role on the search committee. Mm-hmm. And when I've interviewed him, he didn't want to really share a lot of the details about that, which is understandable. He probably was told, like, don't really talk about this, or either way, just respecting the privacy of that search process. Even if he wasn't told that, I guess I shouldn't really say, but the fact that he was involved in those conversations and kind of serving as that liaison to the team, I think is a fascinating perspective to have.
Oh, no doubt.
And another note on Harold Frey real quick is that he, for the past, 2 seasons, I guess, or 3 seasons, he's always been one of the best players to interview. Mm-hmm. And which is, to me, is incredible because English is his second language. And sometimes, obviously, we talk a lot about how impressive he was as an athlete, but I guess I don't necessarily always have the opportunity to kind of share that to people. And I think, just chit-chatting on a podcast is probably a good opportunity to kind of share that. If you never heard an interview with Harold Frey, it's like pretty impressive to know that, he was always extremely well spoken, and it wasn't even his first language.
Yeah. He's a good face for the Bobcats for sure.
Oh yeah. And we should try and get him on. Why not? Who knows? He's going to have a long European career, I imagine.
No, he just took a job. I saw it on Twitter. He's taking a job with like an analytics company for basketball.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Like cerebral. There's the analytics side.
He might have been signing with an agency as well.
No, there's the scoop right there.
Well, before we get off the basketball topic, I do want to, do you have a quick initial impression of the class that Sprinkle assigned to date?
Good question. I would say I always have a very difficult time trying to analyze recruits because you're talking about a lot of times junior college or high school players and another Division I transfer who barely played at North Texas this past season. So a lot of times it's very difficult to project where they might fit in. And, obviously the transition from high school to college is difficult to project. And the transition from junior college to Division I is difficult to project. But what I try to do is look at trends. And the biggest thing that stood out to me was the target on pursuing players who were effective 3-point shooters.
Yeah.
And so that was something that stood out to me in terms of the types of players that they're bringing in, because something that was an issue this past season was they were generally somewhat easy to guard. And I don't mean like they were, when I say easy to guard, I don't necessarily mean like they were bad offensively. But if you look at the players on the roster, other than Harold Frey, most of them really only had like one way to score. You know, so if you look at like Amin Adamu was mostly just driving to the basket, or Layden Ricketts was mostly just shooting the three.
Mhm.
And so, or, Devin Kirby was playing the four, but he's obviously not a 3-point shooter. Traditionally he had played the five throughout his career, and he's kind of messing up the spacing because if you put him on the perimeter, everyone knows he's not going to shoot. And if you put him inside, you kind of mess up the spacing. So, And then Jabril Bella was just like drop, step, and dunk every time, and so, everyone was kind of one dimensional. And a big thing that Danny Sprinkle has talked a lot about is the idea of pursuing players who could dribble, pass, and shoot. And it sounds like super elementary and like super basic, but it is an interesting way to think about it if you break it down in those terms, because, they want to play a 4-out, 1-in offense, and they want to be able to stretch the floor, and they want to be able to use their power forward as a player who could shoot the three, because that opens up spacing and yada, 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 all that modern day type basketball stuff. And so they went out and targeted players who were effective 3-point shooters. So if there's one trend to keep an eye on for the upcoming season, I would say keep an eye on the 3-point shooting and how many dimensions of the offense that they have, because like I said, so many players were kind of one dimensional. And like I said, that's not necessarily a knock on the offense, but that's just kind of the way that they played. And I think now that pretty much, obviously there's still some players who were recruited by Brian Fish, but I think the roster has only one player who played for Brian Fish, which is Devin Kirby. And so everyone else has either been recruited by Danny Sprinkle or has only played in college under Danny Sprinkle, which is kind of a fascinating development, because it's only taken, here we are, a little bit more than a year since he was hired, and almost the entire roster is turned over to an extent. And so that's what I would keep an eye on thinking about next season.
All right. Well, I appreciate the thoughts on the basketball program. It's going to be an interesting season to watch, and should be no surprise to anyone who knows Danny Sprinkle that he would like people who can shoot 3-pointers on his team as a coach.
So, Paul, one of the reasons why we really wanted to talk to you today is talk about the hole in our hearts that is spring ball. I say that with a little tongue in cheek because most of us don't give a rip about spring ball. Is there any specific news, or let me frame it this way? What is the impact of not having spring ball for Montana State, if there is an impact, and kind of what's the next step Montana State needs to do in the next couple months?
Well, I guess if you ask Jeff Choate, he would say it's very minimal.
Yeah, right.
So, he's never been a fan of spring ball. Every single year, he's just out there like just railing against spring football. So I don't I don't think he's too heartbroken about that.
Well, Bozeman springs are just like they're horrible. I mean, you don't know what you're going to get.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the spring game would have been a couple days ago this past weekend, and it was snowing last week. So,
yeah. Right.
So in that sense, I think, so the thing to keep in mind is Jeff Choate's whole argument has always been that practices in the summer are more important than practices in the spring. And so if you think about spring isolated in just the spring, I don't know how much of an impact it makes, other than I think there's some benefits with, you have a new offensive coordinator, you have a potential quarterback battle. Some of those things may be helpful just to get extra work, to get a little bit more familiar on the field, practicing with a new offensive coordinator and running through some of those things. And then he could get familiar with the players and vice versa. But Jeff Choate, especially when you talk about a fifth-year head coach, has kind of established what he wants and has very clear intentions. And so the spring itself, I don't necessarily know how much of an impact, if it's a big impact at all,
Yeah.
He normally doesn't, when they do have spring ball, that, he normally says it's not that big of a deal. And now that they don't have spring ball, he's saying it's also similarly not that big of a deal. The thing that would be worth pointing out is the effect on summer practices. Because I know Montana State shifted to online classes for the summer, and that could have an effect because, like I said, Jeff Choate's whole argument has been that spring ball doesn't matter, but what matters is the practices in the summer. And so then now that is now being affected, that's where I think you could start to have a little bit more of a spillover effect. But the thing that you have to keep in mind too is that every team is going through something similar. So I don't necessarily know if it puts them behind at all. And again, you're talking about a fifth-year head coach. And also the spring practices or the summer practices that they would normally have, a lot of them would be without the coaches anyway because of different rules and such. So those would be a lot of times be player run practices in the summer.
Sure.
I know that's been such a big thing in Schultz culture is just having player standards, player coaching, basically player run type stuff. So that big blow as summer workouts cannot proceed.
Right. So that's what I would, keep in mind. But again, it's every team that's kind of going through something similar. So, and plus, we don't even know like what the season's going to even look like.
No, and we had this on here. I don't know if Ryan wants me to ask this. I'm going to ask it anyway. You don't have to give a real long answer. Do you think there will be a college football season? If you had a gut feeling.
I guess I'll preface this by saying anything that comes out of my mouth in the next 30 seconds is like purely speculation.
I don't like it.
But one, it's really hard to say. Two, there might be a season, but it might not look like what we know college football as, whether that means playing in the spring or whether that means no fans or whether that means whatever other kind of variation, it could happen, but it may be different. And I think we're at the point where maybe we have to start preparing for a situation where what we are used to having with college football might not be possible. And again, I don't know. That's my statement is I don't know. But the other thing to keep in mind is like the Big Sky touches on such a large geographic footprint that, Montana Governor Steve Bullock is talking about, starting to open things back up, within the next 2 weeks. And meanwhile, there's a lot of other places within the Big Sky footprint that are in much different situations compared to what, Montana might be in. So that makes it a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
That's the key factor too, is just this whole thing is probably going to be really complicated.
Well, you're saying it's a bad time to be a podcast without a sponsor looking for a sponsor. Is that what you're saying? All the businesses are shut down. There's not be a college football season. Yeah. We should have secured one last year fully.
I know. We still need one. If you're listening, come talk to us.
If you got any money left, send it our way.
Paul. Right, go ahead. I'll do it. One of the things we wanted to talk to you about on football, of course, is we wanted to pick your brain. Let's just go with this. Give us one of the top one or two position battles you were looking forward to watching during spring ball.
Quarterback.
Oh, I was going to give you a caveat without saying quarterback because that was
you
another
didn't,
question.
Though.
Yeah, I didn't. Okay. All right. Fair enough.
Okay, let's think here for a second. Well, I think I'm just trying to run through the positions in my head. The thing that is interesting over the past couple seasons is you kind of see this progression of the program, and now if you think about like under Jeff Choate now entering his fifth season, they've established depth so that, even the players who are stepping in aren't really like complete unknowns. So what I mean by that is like at wide receiver, for example, they're losing Travis Johnson and Kevin Cassis, but you also bring back Coy Steele and Lance McCutcheon. And Coy Steele and Lance McCutcheon haven't necessarily like made the most catches, especially compared to Cassis and Johnson.
Yeah.
But like they've contributed, and they're two players that I think fans are familiar with. They're not like complete unknowns.
Mm-hmm.
And so, off the top of your head, you think like, okay, you lose Kevin Cassis and Travis Johnson. You think, oh, that would probably be an interesting position battle to watch. But when you think about who would be replacing them, maybe it's not. So, there's just like a lot of depth. I think they bring a lot back. So I don't know. It's hard to say like a specific position battle, but quarterback, obviously that's the easy one.
Well, let's talk about the quarterback. So we have three guys in contention for the quarterback. So we have Tucker Rovig, the incumbent starter, Casey Bauman, who won the starting position last year and then transferred from North Carolina State. Am I correct on that?
Yes.
Yeah, Matt McKay, who brings more of maybe a dual threat nature. I don't know. Haven't seen him really play, but I did watch his highlight film one night on YouTube or something. So obviously I'm an expert, but I mean, so I'm looking at this and we have three guys who've won or have played in Division I games. To me, as a fan, as just me being myself, that's too many. We need, in my perspective, I feel like we should have two at most. And so to open this up again, going into the fifth season under Jeff Choate for a quarterback battle seems to me just a little bit crazy. I don't know why we're continually in this position under Jeff Choate. I thought Tucker Rovig made some really big strides last year towards the end of the year. So I was really surprised when we signed Matt McKay. I just don't know what Jeff Choate is doing here. What are your thoughts?
Well, clearly the coaching staff believes that they could upgrade at quarterback by bringing in Matt McKay, whether that means having him as the starter or whether that means having him to push Tucker Rovig or whether that means just having him in whatever role that they might put him in, because we know that this staff loves to do that. And so I think, Jeff Choate likes having the competition. He hasn't shied away from that. And if they see an opportunity to improve at the quarterback position, I think that's probably the biggest motivation in terms of bringing in Matt McKay. The thing that is really interesting to me about the whole Tucker Rovig thing is like a year ago, we didn't know the answer to this question. But if you were to pose the question, can Montana State reach the FCS semifinals with Tucker Rovig at your quarterback? The answer has been proven fact. In reality, the answer is yes. It is possible. And now whether that means they could improve at quarterback, I mean, you could always find a way to improve. And so if they feel like Matt McKay gives them a better option, obviously they would go with him. But Tucker Rovig is also a somewhat viable option in the sense of he's already proven that the team can get there. And now, obviously, you can argue like, well, they made the semifinals in spite of him rather than because of him. And I mean, he improved as the season went along and ended up proving like that he's capable of taking the team to the semifinals, regardless of all the other outside factors. And so ultimately, that's up to the coaches to decide like who gives them the best chance to win. But it's an interesting situation. And I think a lot less precarious than in previous years because of the way that Tucker Rovig improved throughout last season. So I think you think back to the past two seasons and the quarterback battles that they've had, there was so much more unknown. And now the fact that Tucker Rovig has started for, pretty much a full season or close to a full season last year and went on that playoff run, I think that having him have that experience if you're a fan, I think that probably gives you some kind of sense of security. I don't know. You guys are fans, so maybe you could touch on that better than I could, but he's proven that. And so if Matt McKay is an upgrade over him, then the coaches would go with him. But if not, you have a guy who has that experience that we've all seen play.
Well, I think Ryan and I were pretty impressed with the way Rovig progressed throughout the year. He definitely had ups and downs and lots of speed bumps, but he definitely got better as the year went on. And I was confident with him moving into next year. So I agree with Ryan. I was a little surprised we brought in a quarterback to kind of try and replace him. I mean, that's just like you said, that's what Jeff Choate does, right? He brings in, he'll say it. He'll say, my job is to out recruit you or to find a replacement for you, or I don't know how he phrases it, but it's something along those lines. So it's, I guess in Jeff Choate world, it's really not surprising at all. But I think whoever wins the battle between those three guys, I think we're going to be a better football team offensively throwing the ball than we were last year.
Right. And I think that, if you assume that Tucker Rovig, is the later part of the season Tucker Rovig, and he can kind of build off of that, then at least you kind of have a baseline for what the performance would be, which is probably valuable.
Of course, the whole wrench in the battle is how Udi would like to have his quarterback room look.
Right. And that's probably a situation where maybe having some spring practices might not have hurt them. But that's something that every team's got to deal with. And like you said, you described it as a wrench. I guess I would describe it more of just like an unknown, because we don't know necessarily whether that's a wrench or something different. But that's what, I guess that's why we got to wait and see.
Well, a wrench can be used to fix things, or a wrench can be thrown in to break stuff too. So see, a wrench can go both ways.
I was about to say a wrench or a rose, but I didn't know if that made any sense.
So this is like one of the big things that I do not like what Jeff Choate does. I think he, in this specific instance where we have Tucker Rovig being the man at the later part of the season, all of a sudden we go into the off season and then, guess what? We signed another quarterback. Of course, we're going to sign another quarterback, but to have this transfer of Matt McKay, from an outsider's, from a fan's perspective, I just see it as meddling with Tucker Rovig. And from the outsider's perspective, it doesn't seem to me that Tucker has responded well when that's been the case. He hasn't risen to that level like when Bozeman was, the summer battle going on last year when they were going at it. Tucker didn't really seem to respond to that well. Again, this is just from a fan's perspective, but when he was given the reins as the man, he showed what he could do. So if I'm Tucker Rovig and then I see this Matt McKay, I'm like, okay, we're just going through this again. So maybe he's battle tested in that way, or maybe it just is knocking him back to kind of, square one again. Personally, I feel like Choate should just stick with Rovig or stick with a guy and just, believe in him and make the team go, okay, this is our guy, and just cultivate that leadership within that one dude. Because what it seems to me like right now is, again, we're back at this quarterback battle. I mean, if you've only played under Jeff Choate, that's been the norm. So I guess you don't really know anything else. But I think they're missing out on the opportunity to galvanize that leader right away and then build upon that.
So let's play out this scenario where, now this is kind of a weird thing to do, but let's play out a scenario where Sacramento State beats Austin Peay. Montana State goes on the road and loses to Sacramento State in the quarterfinals in the playoffs. And then, do you still feel similarly about Tucker Rovig?
I guess it would depend on how that game played out. If Rovig threw for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns and no interception, we still lost. I mean, it just depends on the nature of the game. But I mean, I see your point, and yeah, it definitely would take the kind of excitement I have for Rovig, just because he wouldn't have got as far in the playoffs, but that still would have been one of the better playoff appearances like what we've had in the last decade or so. We win a playoff game and then we get blown out was kind of the MO we had there in the Rob Ash era. So, I don't know. It kind of just depends, but I still think I would be still in favor of Rovig and sticking with Rovig unless he had a complete meltdown in this game, in this hypothetical game.
Right. And obviously it's, like you said, it's a hypothetical and, it is one game, but I was just using it in terms of like making the point of like, sometimes our perceptions are just totally shaped by team performance. And if Jeff Choate sees an opportunity to improve the team, he's probably going to do it and let the best man win. And that's kind of been his attitude. And, and I don't necessarily want to compare Matt McKay to Travis Johnson, but Travis Johnson came in a somewhat similar situation, transferring in, intending to play quarterback, not having a spring ball because he got hurt, and then changing positions, and then being a really important contributor. So we don't necessarily know what the future holds for Matt McKay. And if Jeff Choate saw a chance to elevate the room, then that's what he was going to do. But I think you make a good point that Tucker Rovig has not necessarily played his best when he's been in these competitions, but rather when he's been told, okay, you're the guy.
Well, who knows? By the time the Long Island game rolls around or whatever our first game ends up being, whenever it happens to be, Tucker Rovig will be quarterback, Matt McKay will be a safety, and Casey Bauman will be tight end.
Yeah.
I would not be shocked by any of these things.
Or it could be the other way around. It could be Matt McKay quarterback, Tucker Rovig fullback, and Casey Bauman defensive end.
That's the other Jeff Choate MO, right? Changing positions, finding a spot for you.
Yeah. Paul, I do got a question about Jeff Choate for you. And this was something I talked to Thorny last night about. I was like, I'm going to ask him this. Does interviewing Jeff Choate or asking Jeff Choate a question after a loss, does that intimidate you?
No.
Damn it. So I am very envious of that, because the one time I was in the room with Jeff Choate, I was in the room twice with Jeff Choate, and both times I shrunk like a little sissy in the back of the room. Had opportunities to talk to him, but it was just, I don't know, man. The guy makes me a little bit nervous when I'm around him.
The one thing I guess I would say is his press conferences are fascinating, and they have a very interesting rhythm to them. And he is very explanatory, and he's a very well-spoken representative for the university. And when he says things in press conferences, he is very intentional with his messaging. And so anytime you see something or watch one of his press conferences, I would just keep in mind that he's very aware of who he's speaking to and what his messages are. And so when he goes on he used to go on his little tangents about wanting facilities, and then now his new big message has been about like cost of attendance, because they got the facilities thing figured out. So now he needs like a new thing to talk about. He's very intentional. And so that's something I would recommend also, just like keeping in mind when you watch his press conferences.
Yeah, we had the opportunity for homecoming to go sit in the press conference there. And neither of us were definitely going to ask a question. And that thing is definitely a little intimidating meeting him for the first time, or not even meeting him, just being in the same room with him, and the way he presents himself and talks and his like, booming voice and all that stuff. Yeah,
and I would also add that I'm appreciative of how explanatory he is, because I think he definitely does explain his thinking, whether you agree with it or disagree with it or whatever. He is very clear in terms of like what his attitude and what his approach is, which I think as a reporter, I'm appreciative of that, because, we're asking him questions to find out information and find out explanations and rationales and all this, that, and the other. And he does a pretty good job of answering those questions comprehensively, which I'm appreciative of.
Yeah. Jeff Choate comes out and spends like the first 5 to 10 minutes talking before he even fields any questions. Do you just sit there and just like check off questions you had because he pretty much just answers them all in one giant diatribe?
Well, usually he's talking about the other team, and he's always extremely complimentary of the other team. So I guess he usually checks off our questions about the other team. Like if we have like a specific question about, Kevin Thompson, a quarterback from Sacramento State, and then he'll just go on like a 3-minute rant about Kevin Thompson, like, oh, this guy's a great player. He's had a great season, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, I should, I say that jokingly, but, he is very, very, very elaborate in his assessment of his opponents.
Oh, yes. It's very entertaining to listen to. Like I love listening to Jeff Choate's press conferences. Stark contrast to the way Rob Ash handled his press conferences, where he basically didn't answer anything. And his stock answer was always, I'll have to look at the tape. Like I haven't watched the game film yet. That was pretty much his answer to every single question. So a lot more entertaining to watch Jeff Choate.
Hey, Paul, has Jeff Choate ever chewed you out off air?
I'll go with a no comment on that question.
Fair enough.
And then I will say we once had a very funny interaction. Well, it wasn't funny in the moment, but looking back, I can kind of laugh about it. This was before they played Western Illinois in 2018. And Western Illinois had a defensive tackle who ended up being like a decent NFL prospect. And he was like one of the best players on Western Illinois' defense. And I take the blame for this because I kind of didn't really think this through. But I asked him, so Jeff Choate goes on that whole opening statement, whole thing, and he's like, whatever number the guy was, let's say if he was number 99, he's like, number 99, like that guy's a dude. That guy's going to be that guy's a great player. He could have a future in the NFL. We're going to have a really tough time. Like we're going to have to really, do something about him and game plan for him. And I asked the question. I said, obviously you spoke highly of him. Do you have a plan to stop him, or do you have a plan to block him? And he just like stared at me. And he goes, yes, we have a plan. And then he pauses and he goes, let's dial in our questions a little bit. and looking back, I mean, I don't blame him for saying that, because in fairness, like maybe I could have phrased the question a little bit better. But it was kind of funny. And it's funny looking back on now. But at the time I was just like, oh geez, this is not good. And the thing is that, those press conferences, like, the full video gets out and anyone could watch them.
Yeah.
And I could just look like a complete fool. And that's fine. And, you learn from that kind of stuff. I don't necessarily mind that, that give and take. And, I think I agreed with him. I could have dialed in my questions a little bit better, but it was definitely was kind of funny and definitely caught me off guard too.
Yeah. That's good, man.
I totally will not be Googling the press conference for the Western Illinois Gold Rush game in 2018.
No one Google that.
It does not exist. It's not on the internet anywhere, I'm sure. All right. Well, Ryan, you got any other questions on the football side of things?
No, that's all I got.
That's a good way to end it.
Yeah.
Well, we talked a little bit before we started recording here, a little bit about the facilities and any news there you have to offer. I don't know if there's much news right now. We're just kind of wondering if that we're going to be breaking ground anytime soon, or if that's something that's being delayed.
So as of now, I believe it's being delayed, and I'm not sure really what the whole deal is with that. I know it was obviously planned to have a groundbreaking this spring, but everything right now is just kind of up in the air. So not entirely sure of where that's going.
Do you know what the next phase in the fundraising portion is, like the next project that they hope to get done?
That's a good question. I think it's accessible online somewhere. in terms of beginning phase 2 of the 20-year master plan, which is like athletic director Leon Costello's baby, essentially.
Yeah.
But I don't know what it is, but I don't think they'll be jumping. Whatever it is, I don't know off the top of my head, but whatever it is, I don't think they'll be jumping into it right away, because I believe that their plan is to kind of do some work on some smaller projects. And also, first of all, get phase 1 built.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely can't put the cart before the horse here. It's nothing's built yet.
Yeah. Priorities for them, I think, are to get phase 1 built and then maybe also work on some smaller projects before anything bigger. Although I don't know exactly, but I'm sure that an indoor practice facility is somewhere on that list.
I think that would make Jeff Choate completely change his tune about spring football.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of financial balls in the air, I guess. I know there's we just got this done. The next thing, indoor practice facility, whatever it may be, but also I don't know how the fundraising or how any of that's working for cost of attendance. I know next to nothing about it. I don't even know if it's going to happen, but I imagine that's got to tie up some fundraising if that were to actually happen for the next season.
Yeah, and some of that stuff, even, I mean, some of those conversations that were going on about that was like in the pre-coronavirus world. And so right now, just, I mean, so much is up in the air, but like if there's a significantly altered football season, that would affect revenues. So that's another factor too, I'm sure, for the athletic department in terms of just figuring out their finances.
That's a good point. If there's no ticket sales or anything for a whole year, that's going to put a big dent in a lot of things.
Right. So I think all these projects, you know, we were kind of thinking about them differently, and we might have to recalibrate our thinking a little bit.
Right on. Well, Paul, that's basically, man, that's all we have for you. We just really want to thank you for your time and your candor. Why don't you let the listeners know where we could find you?
So you can find our articles online at BozemanDailyChronicle.com, and then as well as on Twitter. I'm at P Schweds at PSCHWEDS, and then the sports editor of the Bozeman Chronicle is also on Twitter at CPool Reporter, CPOOLREPORTER, Colton Pool.
We'll make sure to tag you when we do our little release tweet thing. Make sure people know where they can find you if they don't already. And like I said, thanks for coming on. We certainly appreciate the work you do of covering the Bobcats. It's just something that, you know, obviously Ryan and I hold dear to our hearts, big Bobcat fans, and we just consume every single piece of content we can find. And we appreciate everything you do for the Bobcats.
Oh, thank you for following along. And I'm glad that you like that stuff. So thank you.
All right, Paul, thanks again, and have a good night.
Thanks. Talk to you later.